Story 1. One morning, I woke to a strange sense of unease, as if the air itself had thickened overnight. There was something off, but I couldn't pinpoint it at first. When my eyes finally opened, I saw it, the front door, wide open. I could feel the panic start to rise. I distinctly remembered locking it the night before. I even checked twice, reassuring myself that the deadbolt had clicked into place. But now, there it was, swinging open, as if someone had been inside. I lay there, frozen for a moment, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe I had just forgotten. Maybe I left it open without realizing. But deep down, I knew better. I was certain I'd locked it. Always. And yet, there it was. That door, open. An invitation, or a warning. I dragged myself out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I walked cautiously toward the door, my every step an effort to ignore the dread clawing at my insides. Peering into the hallway, I saw no sign of struggle, no broken glass, no forced entry. The frame was intact, the lock undamaged. Everything looked normal. But the door, wide open, screamed otherwise. Stepping outside, I scanned the yard. Nothing. No footprints in the dirt. No movement. Only the eerie quiet of the morning. I checked the lock again, just to be sure. It clicked when I turned the knob. But still, something gnawed at me. How could it be open? And who, if anyone, had come in? I scoured the house, checking every room, every window. Everything seemed undisturbed. No broken glass. No open windows. And yet, the feeling of being watched lingered, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I called the police, even though I had no idea what they could do. The officer who came seemed skeptical, as if chalking it up to forgetfulness. He glanced around quickly, saw nothing out of place, and shrugged it off. "Maybe you forgot to lock it," he said, flashing me a reassuring smile. Or maybe the wind blew it open. But deep down, I didn't believe him. I couldn't. There were no signs of a break-in, no evidence of anyone inside, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The officer left, but the unease settled deeper into my bones. I tried to dismiss it, tried to move on, but each morning the same dread washed over me as I walked to the front door. It was always locked, yet the thought of it being open again haunted me. What if someone had been inside? What if they were still watching? I began to notice small things around the house, subtle, but unsettling. A chair that was slightly turned. A picture frame out of place. The faintest scent of something unfamiliar in the air. At first, I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But the more I noticed, the more I started to wonder, was I paranoid, or was something truly wrong? One night, I decided to stay up late, hoping to catch whoever, or whatever, was opening the door. The house was dark, silent, the air heavy with tension. My eyes were locked on the front door, fighting the pull of sleep. The minutes dragged on, but I couldn't afford to blink. Not with the door opening every night around 3 a.m. Then, a soft creak echoed through the hallway, like the faintest whisper of movement. My heart skipped a beat. I strained my ears, waiting, but nothing came. I waited, heart pounding, until I couldn't stand it anymore. I crept toward the door, my breath shallow, the darkness swallowing me whole. As I reached the door, I held my breath, slowly peering outside. There was nothing. Nothing at all. I checked the lock again, my pulse quickening, and yet, I couldn't shake the feeling. Something had been there. I could feel it. I wasn't imagining it. The next morning, I reviewed the security footage from the cameras I had installed months ago. My hands shook as I scrolled through the footage, my stomach twisting into knots. When I reached the time around 3 a.m., I stopped. There, just outside the door, a shadowy figure moved, barely visible in the dim light. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Someone had been standing by my door. I rewound the footage and watched it again, over and over, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure didn't open the door, but it was so close, so disturbingly close. I could even hear the faintest sound of breathing through the speaker before the footage cut off, as if whoever was there knew exactly when the cameras would stop recording. The feeling of being watched only grew stronger. I locked the door twice, checked the windows, turned on every light in the house before bed. But no matter how careful I was, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the feeling that someone was still out there, watching, waiting. Story 2. For days, strange scratching sounds echoed through the walls of my home. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, those usual creaks and groans that old buildings make. But the noise didn't stop. It only grew louder, sharper, more persistent as the days went on, like something, or someone, was scraping at the inside of the walls. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that my imagination was running wild, but each night, as the scratching grew, it became impossible to ignore. I convinced myself it was just rats or some other harmless nuisance. But when I lay in bed, heart pounding in the silence, the scratching would begin again, rhythmic, deliberate, as if claws were dragging across the drywall. A deep unease settled in my chest, and no matter how hard I tried to dismiss it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. One restless evening, unable to sleep, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and started tapping the walls, trying to locate the source of the noise. My fingers traced every surface, no cracks, no holes, nothing. Everything seemed normal, but the sound refused to stop. I laughed nervously, trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, but the gnawing feeling remained. It wasn't until the following night that I realized something much more terrifying was happening. The scratching, what had been a simple, unsettling noise, was now accompanied by something else, a voice. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but as I lay in bed, the whispering grew clearer. Faint, but unmistakable. My name. Help me. It chilled me to the bone. I froze, heart racing, as the words echoed in my ears. It sounded like me, or someone with the same voice, calling from deep within the walls. I sat up, the room suddenly growing cold, the scratching now replaced by a low, desperate whisper. Come closer. I couldn't breathe. My body felt paralyzed, as if the very walls were closing in on me. The voice seemed to come from inches away, just behind the plaster, but when I tried to rationalize it, nothing made sense. It wasn't a recording, nor a strange echo. It sounded too real, too familiar. It was my voice. My own voice, begging for help from inside the walls. The next day, I tried to push the fear aside, convincing myself I was overthinking it. But that night, the scratching and whispering returned. This time, the voice was frantic. Desperate. It wasn't just calling my name, it was pleading. Please, let me out. The urgency in its tone made my skin crawl. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to find out what was causing this. My hands shook as I grabbed the flashlight and searched the room, tapping the walls, looking for any sign of an opening. There was nothing. No crack. No hole. No way anything could be trapped inside. I went outside, hoping to find some explanation. The walls were solid, untouched, with no sign of disturbance. My mind raced, but nothing made sense. It felt like I was losing my grip on reality, hearing my own voice, trapped in the house, calling to me. That night, I could no longer ignore the terror that gripped me. The voice was louder now, right beside me, as if it were coming from inside the walls. I felt suffocated, as if the very air was being stolen from me. It wasn't just calling my name anymore, it was pleading, begging, desperate. With trembling hands, I grabbed a hammer and started chipping away at the plaster. Each strike made the scratching grow louder, more frantic. And then, finally, there was a crack. I widened the hole, my heart hammering in my chest as the voice grew clearer, almost deafening. It was as if it were just behind the wall, inches from my face. When I pulled away the plaster, I expected to see something, anything, but there was nothing. No hidden space, no creature lurking in the dark. Just a deep, empty cavity that seemed to stretch on forever, into darkness. But as I stared into the blackness, I felt a chill run down my spine. The voice, it was still there. Not coming from behind the wall, but coming from within me. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. The voice wasn't coming from the walls, it was coming from inside me. It was trapped in my mind, in my very soul, and I was helpless to stop it. I staggered back, horrified, as the whispers grew louder, more frantic. Please, let me out. I dropped the hammer, my legs giving way beneath me. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing tighter, suffocating me. The voice, it was me. It was always me. And I knew, deep down, that there was no way to silence it. No way to escape the nightmare that had rooted itself deep inside my mind. The walls, the house, everything around me, it was all part of it now. Trapping me in a nightmare with no escape. Story 3. I had been cleaning out the storage unit for hours, sorting through forgotten boxes of childhood mementos, dusty furniture, and random trinkets. The place was a mess, filled with things that seemed to have been abandoned by time itself. Located in a quiet corner of town, far from the bustle of daily life, it always had a strange sense of stillness, like nothing moved there, not even time. As I sifted through the clutter, my hands landed on a small, nondescript box, oddly heavy for its size. Curiosity gnawed at me, and I opened it, not expecting anything of importance. But what I found made my heart stop. Inside was a stack of old photographs, their edges yellowed with age, some curling at the corners. I flipped through them, each one making my pulse race faster. They were all pictures of me, taken from angles and in places I didn't recognize. The first photo showed me sitting on a park bench. The trees in the background looked familiar, but the bench? I had never seen it before. My face, though unmistakably mine, seemed wrong somehow, as though I was unaware of the camera. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I set that photo aside, my hands shaking, and grabbed another. This one was even more unsettling. It was taken from behind, showing me walking down a narrow alley. The warm brick walls, the faint glow of a streetlight, it all felt so familiar, yet I was certain I had never walked down that alley. The scene was haunting, the silence in the photo somehow echoing in my mind. I could almost hear my footsteps in my head, but I had no memory of being there. The more I flipped through, the more bizarre the locations became. One picture showed me standing outside a small, run-down house, its windows boarded up, the yard choked with weeds. I didn't recognize the house, nor could I fathom how I had ended up there. Another showed me in front of a dark, abandoned warehouse, its looming presence casting an oppressive shadow. The sky was stormy, the atmosphere foreboding. I had never seen that warehouse before in my life, but there I was, standing in front of it, with a strange expression on my face. Panic began to rise in my chest. How had these photos been taken? Who had taken them? The more I examined them, the more paranoid I became. Had someone been following me? Watching me, capturing moments of my life I couldn't remember? I inspected the photos with growing dread. Some were blurry, as if taken from a distance, while others were crystal clear, almost too clear, as if the photographer had been standing right next to me. Every photo made me feel increasingly uneasy. I was always unaware of the camera, my posture relaxed, my expression neutral. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I felt watched. Even in the moments I couldn't remember, I felt eyes on me. One photo caught my attention more than the others. A close-up of me, standing in what looked like a small, dimly lit room. The harsh lighting cast deep shadows across my face, making it difficult to see clearly. The furniture, the way the light hit the walls, it all felt oddly familiar, as if I had been there before. But the memory refused to come. I stared at it, my mind racing, trying to place the room. But it was as if the memory was just out of reach, slipping away every time I tried to grasp it. Fear began to suffocate me. My thoughts spun in circles, trying to make sense of it all. Who had taken these photos? Why? And, more chillingly, how did they know me so well? These weren't random snapshots, they were pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. I shoved the photos back into the box, trying to push down the growing unease. My hands trembled as I closed the lid and shoved it to the back of the storage unit. I wanted to forget about them, to lock the door and pretend none of this had ever happened. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. I could feel it, someone had been watching me, following me, capturing moments I had no memory of. And they weren't done yet. That night, sleep eluded me. I kept replaying the photos in my mind, trying to make sense of them, but the more I thought about it, the more disconnected I felt from my own life. It was as if someone else was writing my story, and I was nothing more than a passive observer. The next day, I returned to the storage unit, desperate for answers. I opened the box again, but to my horror, it was empty. The photos were gone. Panic surged through me as I tore through the unit, opening every box, pulling things off the shelves, but there was no sign of the pictures. It was as if they had never existed at all. I stood there, staring at the empty box, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Had I imagined it all? Was I losing my mind, or had someone been playing a cruel game with me, leaving clues just to watch me unravel? With a sense of growing dread, I locked the storage unit and walked away, feeling more lost than ever. But even as I stepped outside into the cool evening air, the feeling didn't leave me. It clung to me like a shadow, as if someone, somewhere, was still watching. And I knew, with a sinking certainty, that this was only the beginning. Story 4. It started quietly, just a faint sound in the dead of night. At first, I thought I was imagining it, a trick of my tired mind after a long day of work. But on the second night, it came again. A whisper, soft yet distinct, drifting up from the kitchen. It was my name, clear as day, Sarah. My heart raced as I lay frozen in bed, trying to make sense of it. I lived alone in a small, cozy house on the edge of town. There was no one else around for miles, and I was used to the solitude. I had never been afraid of the dark, but this felt different. The whisper, it felt too real. Too deliberate. It was as though someone was standing just outside my bedroom door, calling to me, even though I knew no one was there. The first few nights, I convinced myself it was nothing, maybe the wind, or the house settling. I heard the occasional creak of floorboards or the soft hum of the refrigerator, but this was different. The whisper wasn't random. It was a voice, gentle, almost familiar, like someone trying to get my attention. But there was no one in the kitchen. No one anywhere in the house. On the fourth night, I couldn't take it anymore. The whisper came again, sharp and clear, Sarah. I bolted out of bed, my feet hitting the cold floor with a thud, my heart pounding as I made my way to the kitchen. I turned on the lights and scanned the room, but there was nothing. The same empty kitchen, as it had been all day. I checked the back door, the windows, the pantry, even the cabinets, but everything was locked, everything in place. No sign of anyone. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that I was exhausted and my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The whisper felt too personal, too real. The next night, I stayed up later than usual, determined to catch whatever was causing the sound. I sat in the living room, the TV playing softly in the background, but my eyes were fixed on the hallway that led to the kitchen. Sure enough, just as the clock struck midnight, it came again. The same whisper, Sarah. I stood, pulse quickening. I was terrified, but I had to know what was happening. Slowly, I made my way down the hallway, my steps muffled by the carpet. The kitchen light was already on, casting long shadows across the floor. As I approached, I felt it, a chill in the air, like something was wrong. Something wasn't right. The room was empty, just like the night before. I checked the fridge, the cupboards, the drawers, even though I knew there was nothing there. It was like I was searching for an answer, some kind of explanation. But there was none. No source for the voice. No reason for the whisper. I was alone in the house. And yet, it felt as though something else was there with me. Every time I left the kitchen, I had the unsettling feeling of being followed. The whispers continued, every night. Sometimes they were faint, almost inaudible, and other times they were so loud and clear they seemed to echo in my ears. On the seventh night, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed help. I grabbed my phone and called a friend, asking if they could come over. I needed someone who could help me make sense of what was happening. But when I went to the door to let them in, no one was there. I checked my phone, no missed calls, no messages. My friend hadn't answered. They weren't coming. Panic rose in my chest, and that's when I realized something far worse. The whispers hadn't just been coming from the kitchen. They were coming from inside the walls. I'd heard it faintly before, like a soft murmur, but now it was clear. The voice wasn't just confined to the kitchen anymore, it was everywhere, echoing through the house. I stood paralyzed in the hallway, fear gnawing at me as the whispers grew louder, more desperate, urging me to come closer. "Sarah," it called again. But this time, it wasn't a whisper, it was louder. More insistent. As if the voice was right next to me. I turned and ran, stumbling over my feet as I made my way out the front door. The cool night air hit me, but it did little to calm my racing heart. I stood there for what felt like hours, trying to collect my thoughts. I was terrified, but I couldn't go back in. Not with the whispers still echoing in my ears. I spent the rest of the night sitting in my car, staring at the house. I knew I couldn't go back inside until I figured out what was happening. I didn't know if it was a haunting or something else, but one thing was clear, I couldn't stay there any longer. The next day, I called a local paranormal investigator. They did a thorough search of the house, but found nothing unusual. No hidden speakers. No electrical malfunctions. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The investigator told me it was possible I had been hearing things due to stress, but I knew the truth. The whispers weren't just in my head. They were real. And they weren't done with me yet. Story 5. It was a Tuesday, just like any other, or so I thought. I had just returned from a quick trip to the grocery store when something caught my attention. As I fumbled through my bag for my phone, my fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. Surprised, I pulled it out, and my breath caught in my throat. It was a watch, a sleek, expensive-looking piece with a gleaming silver band and a deep blue face that glinted in the light in a way that felt unnatural. I stared at it, my heart racing. I didn't remember buying it. I didn't even recall seeing anything like it before. It wasn't the kind of watch I'd choose, let alone spend money on. I flipped it over, half expecting to see a price tag, a brand name, or some sort of engraving that could offer an explanation. But there was nothing. Just a polished, smooth surface that reflected my puzzled face back at me. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I retraced my steps. The grocery store, it seemed impossible that I'd picked it up by mistake, and yet. I checked my receipt. No mention of a watch. No memory of seeing anyone else with one like it, no indication that it had accidentally slipped into my bag. I showed it to my roommate. She took one look at it, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Where did you get this?" she asked, turning the watch over in her hands. I shook my head. "I have no idea." She suggested it might be a gift or that I'd bought it and forgotten, but nothing fit. Nothing made sense. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I googled the watch, brand, style, everything I could. It was high-end, something I could never afford. The more I looked into it, the more I felt like I was falling into a nightmare. The watch was worth thousands of dollars, but I had no memory of receiving it, buying it, or even wanting it. It didn't belong to me. It felt like a piece of someone else's life had been carelessly dropped into mine. I asked everyone I knew if they'd given it to me. Friends, family, everyone was just as baffled as I was. No one could explain how it had ended up in my bag. I thought back to the last party I'd attended, wondering if someone had slipped it in as a prank. But no one had even mentioned it. The longer I kept the watch, the more ominous it became. It wasn't just the mystery of its origin, it was the way it made me feel. There was something wrong about it. Every time I looked at it, I felt like I was being watched, like something dark was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. One night, unable to shake the feeling, I decided to take the watch to a jeweler. Perhaps he could help. The jeweler examined it carefully, his eyes widening as he looked at the craftsmanship. "This is real," he murmured, his voice low. "I've never seen anything like it. But there's no serial number, no markings to trace it back to the original owner." I left the shop feeling more lost than before. If it was truly one of a kind, how had it ended up with me? Then strange things started happening. I left the watch on my kitchen counter one night, and when I returned the next morning, it was in a different spot, closer to the edge. I tried to convince myself I had simply forgotten where I'd placed it, but the next time it happened, it was impossible to ignore. The watch was moving. Not just a few inches, but several feet, sometimes, as if an invisible hand was guiding it. It was as though the watch had a mind of its own, a force of its own. I started wondering if I was losing my mind. Surely there was a logical explanation, right? But the longer I had the watch, the more it seemed like it was part of something larger, something beyond my understanding. I decided to take a break, hoping stepping away from it would clear my head. I placed it in a drawer, out of sight. The next morning, I found it back on the counter, exactly where it had been before. I checked the drawer. Empty. How was this possible? How could the watch be moving on its own when I knew where I had left it? I started to fear I was losing control of reality. I couldn't explain what was happening, and I didn't know who to turn to for answers. No one I asked could shed light on the mystery. The watch didn't belong to anyone I knew, and the odd occurrences kept growing more disturbing. I couldn't shake the feeling that the watch was connected to me in some way I didn't understand, that somehow, it had found its way into my life with a purpose, one I couldn't control. In a desperate attempt to end the strange happenings, I locked the watch in a safe. For a while, things seemed to return to normal. But deep down, I knew the watch wasn't finished with me. And one day, it would find its way back into my life, bringing with it more questions than answers. Story 6. It was an ordinary afternoon when I decided to take a walk through the downtown area. The streets were alive, full of people, their chatter and footsteps merging with the hum of the city. I had no particular destination in mind, simply enjoying the sun on my face and the cool breeze as I drifted from shop to shop. The storefronts shimmered in the daylight, reflecting the vibrant energy of the street. As I passed one particularly large window, something caught my eye in the reflection. I glanced at the glass, expecting to see my own image, but froze in place. There, standing right next to me, was a figure. It looked exactly like me. Same clothes, same posture, same expression. My heart skipped a beat as I quickly turned to look over my shoulder, but no one was there. I turned back to the window. The figure was gone. All I saw now was the empty reflection of the street behind me. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. It was so clear, so vivid, yet it made no sense. How could someone be standing beside me without my noticing? I was alone, yet that perfect mirror image had been there, right beside me. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe I had imagined it. But the unease crawled up my spine as I continued down the street, trying to shake off the feeling that I was being watched. The more I thought about it, the stranger the experience became. Had there been anyone else nearby when I first looked at the window? I couldn't remember. I tried to dismiss it, but something about the reflection had felt too real, too intentional. It was as though it wasn't just a reflection, but a presence. Something that had no business being there. As I walked, I kept glancing at every window, half expecting to see that figure again. But each time I passed a reflective surface, my own image stared back at me, just as it should. Yet, I couldn't shake the memory of that moment, the fleeting glimpse of someone who looked exactly like me, but wasn't me. It didn't feel right. It was as if that reflection had been a part of me, but also not. When I reached the park at the end of the block, I sat on a bench, trying to clear my head. The sounds of birds and rustling leaves should have been soothing, but my mind kept returning to that reflection. What had I seen? Was it possible someone had copied my appearance? Or was it something more, unsettling? I shivered at the thought. I had to know if it was real or if my mind had played tricks on me. After a few minutes, I stood up and walked back toward the store where the strange reflection had appeared. My pulse quickened as I neared the window again, half hoping nothing would happen this time. As I got closer, I couldn't resist looking into the glass. This time, my reflection was gone. The window showed nothing but the empty street. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Something wasn't right. I stepped back, trying to calm my racing heart. Had I imagined it all? Was it just a fleeting lapse in perception? Then, as I turned to leave, I caught a movement from the corner of my eye. In the reflection of the store window, I saw a figure standing behind me, exactly like me. Same clothes. Same posture. But when I spun around, there was no one there. Just the empty street. My breath caught in my throat. I was rooted to the spot, staring at the barren street, trying to make sense of it all. It was as if my reflection had a mind of its own, appearing and disappearing at will, never quite matching the world around me. I quickly left the area, my steps quickening with every passing second. The sensation of being followed was growing stronger, creeping up my spine. It was as though the reflection was still there, trailing me from behind. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see the figure again, but every time, there was nothing. When I finally made it home, I rushed inside and locked the door behind me. I paced around my apartment, trying to calm myself. But the memory of that reflection, the perfect mirror image of myself, but somehow not me, refused to leave my mind. I couldn't focus on anything that evening. I checked every window in my apartment, making sure no one else was there. Every time I looked, my own image stared back at me. I wanted to believe it had all been a mistake, a fleeting illusion. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. And as I lay in bed that night, the sound of my own breathing the only thing anchoring me, I couldn't help but wonder, what if I was never truly alone? What if that reflection was still out there, watching, waiting? The thought sent a chill down my spine. And I knew, in the deepest part of my mind, would never look at a store window the same way again. Story 7. I'd always been vigilant about locking my doors. The world had a way of making you paranoid, and I preferred the comfort of knowing my home was safe. So, when I woke up one morning and found my front door slightly ajar, I assumed I must have forgotten to lock it the night before. But something about it didn't sit right. I couldn't remember leaving it unlocked. A sense of unease gnawed at me as I decided to check the footage from my home security camera. The camera had always been my reassurance, the one thing I trusted to keep me safe. I opened the app, scrolling through the recordings, my eyes darting for anything unusual. At first, everything seemed normal. There I was, leaving for work the day before, locking the door behind me and heading out. Nothing out of the ordinary. The footage was exactly as I remembered it, and I felt a small breath of relief. Maybe I had just imagined the door being open. But then, as I reached the footage from the night before, something stopped me cold. In the background, just as I stepped out the door, I saw it. A figure. At first, it was so subtle, just a shadow lurking at the edge of the frame. Tall, thin, and motionless, standing against the darkness. My heart skipped a beat as I rewound the footage and froze it. There was no mistaking it now. The figure was there, standing in the shadows of my front yard, barely visible but unmistakably real. The camera's low light made it hard to see clearly, but I could make out the faint outline of a person. They were facing my house, unmoving. A chill slithered down my spine. Panic surged, and I rewound the footage further, desperate to understand. The timestamp showed it had been just minutes after I left. How could I not have noticed someone standing there? I was certain I had locked the door, but now doubt crept in. My mind raced, trying to piece it all together. The figure remained still, blending into the shadows, as though it were part of the night itself. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. I played the footage again, listening for any noise, but all I could hear was the soft rustling of trees in the breeze. The figure didn't react to anything, as if waiting for something, or someone. The more I stared at the screen, the more it felt as though the figure knew I was watching. It was an irrational thought, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was terribly wrong. My breath grew shallow as I kept my eyes fixed on the screen, watching the minutes drag by. The figure never moved, but I felt the tension in my chest grow with every passing second. Desperate to see if anything else had happened, I fast-forwarded to the next clip. It showed me returning home from work, blissfully unaware of the presence that had been there earlier. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and everything seemed perfectly normal. But then I noticed something. This all happened after I'd left, long before I'd returned. My stomach dropped. If the figure had been standing there after I left, they must have known I was gone. They must have been waiting for me to leave. But for what? I pulled up the footage from the interior cameras, hoping to find some sign that the figure had entered my home. But everything was untouched, the kitchen, the living room, my bedroom, all exactly as I'd left them. But the unease, it didn't go away. Then, just as I was about to give up, I saw it. The figure finally moved, but not how I expected. The timestamp showed it just before the camera cut off. The figure turned and walked slowly toward the edge of the yard, as though fading into the darkness, retreating from the camera's view. The strange thing was, I hadn't heard anything the night before, no footsteps, no rustling, no knocks at the door. It was as if the figure had come and gone without leaving a trace. My mind raced. Was it someone I knew? A neighbor? Or had this been someone watching me for much longer than I realized? The thought of someone lurking outside my house, waiting for me to leave, made my skin crawl. I immediately called the police, hoping they could offer some kind of explanation. When they arrived, they scoured the area around my house, but found no signs of anyone having been there, no footprints, no disturbed branches, no signs of entry. It was as if the figure had never been there at all. The police advised me to change the locks and double-check my cameras, but no amount of security could shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I walked past the front door, I found myself glancing out the window, half expecting to see that same figure standing there. Weeks have passed since that night, but the unease still lingers. I check the security footage before bed, every night, hoping not to see that figure again. But deep down, I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to return. Story 8. It all began with a friend request from someone I didn't recognize. The profile picture was blurry, but there was something eerily familiar about the face, something that gnawed at the edges of my memory. The name was generic, no mutual friends, which should have made it easy to ignore, but the message that accompanied it was what truly froze me. I've been looking for you for a long time. My curiosity, as it often does, got the better of me. I clicked on the profile. The account was new, with only a few posts, but there was a strange tension in the way the messages were written, a subtle weight to them that unsettled me. It was as if this person knew things about me, small, private details I'd never shared online. The first message sent a chill through me. I remember when you used to wear that red jacket every day in high school. I froze. I hadn't worn that jacket in years. Only a handful of people knew about it. A sense of unease washed over me, but I couldn't look away. I dug deeper into the profile. The posts were vague, almost ghost-like, but they hinted at parts of my past that I had long forgotten. One referenced a trip I took with my family to a quiet lake when I was a child. Another mentioned a dog I had when I was younger, things I'd only shared with a few close friends. None of it should have been public knowledge. My pulse quickened with each new message. I remember when we used to walk home together after school, and you always stopped at the corner store to buy a pack of gum. That was a memory I'd buried, forgotten completely. The stranger was pulling things out of my subconscious like pulling strings from an old, worn-out sweater. I hovered over the keyboard, torn between blocking them and asking, "Who are you?" The response came swiftly, almost too quickly, as if they had been waiting for me to ask. "You really don't remember me, do you?" I guess that's what happens when time passes. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I hadn't seen anyone from my past in years. But this person knew me too well to be a stranger. The name they used was unfamiliar, but their messages felt personal, intimate even, like we shared some long-forgotten history. The more I investigated their profile, the more unnerving it became. They described places I used to hang out, down to the smallest details, making it feel like they had been there with me. Then, I stumbled upon a photo, a group of people laughing at a party. One of them was someone I hadn't seen in ages, a friend I had lost touch with years ago. My stomach dropped. I clicked on their name. Their account had been deactivated. A chilling thought gripped me. What if this wasn't someone from my past? What if it was someone who had been watching me all these years? I couldn't shake the feeling of being stalked, but there was no one I could think of who would have ever been obsessed with me. In a moment of defiance, I confronted them. "Who are you really? What do you want from me?" The response came instantly, too instantly. "You're the one who forgot me, but I remember everything about you." The words were laced with something cold, something unsettling. Then, the next message arrived, and it made my blood run cold. I was there when it happened. "You don't remember, but I do." My mind raced. What had happened? What were they talking about? I didn't know. But their words pulled at something dark in me, a secret buried deep. I couldn't ignore the sensation that they knew something, something I had tried to forget. The next few days were a blur, filled with sleepless nights, obsessing over the conversation, trying to piece together the fragments of my past. Then it hit me, a memory, sharp and sudden, from my teenage years. An accident. A moment when I had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Someone had been hurt. I had never spoken of it to anyone, not even my closest friends. Yet somehow, this stranger knew. The realization slammed into me like a punch to the gut. The person wasn't just someone from my past, they were there that day. They had witnessed everything. I felt a rising panic. Who were they? Why had they waited all this time? The details were slipping through my fingers like sand, just out of reach. In one last, desperate attempt, I asked, "What do you want from me?" The reply was simple. Haunting. Cold. "I want you to remember." It was a warning, a challenge, and a threat all at once. This person had been waiting for this moment, waiting for me to acknowledge them. I deleted the account. Blocked the number. Tried to move on. But deep down, I knew the nightmare wasn't over. Whoever they were still out there, watching. Waiting. And as much as I wanted to forget, I couldn't shake the feeling that they would find me again, one way or another. Story 9. It all started innocently enough with a plain package left on my doorstep. The box was nondescript, devoid of any markings except for a shipping label bearing my name and address. At first, I thought it was a mistake, a mix-up from some online store I'd ordered from recently. I didn't recognize the store's name on the return address, but I figured I must have ordered something and forgotten about it. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. Inside, wrapped in protective foam, was a set of high-end kitchen knives, sharp, professional-grade blades. I had never bought anything like this, nor did I have any interest in upgrading my kitchen. I stared at them for a moment, an unsettling sensation creeping down my spine. Perhaps it was a gift, I thought, but from who? No one I knew would send me something so random. The next day, another package arrived, even stranger than the last. A designer handbag, sleek and expensive looking, tucked neatly inside a dust bag. I didn't recognize the brand, and once again, I had no memory of purchasing it. My first instinct was to call the company listed on the shipping label, but when I dialed the number, it was disconnected. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Who was sending me these things, and why? I spent the next few days scouring my recent online purchases, hoping for a clue, but there was nothing, no receipts, no confirmation emails, no record of any transactions for either the knives or the handbag. My bank account and credit card statements looked normal, with no suspicious charges. I was at a loss. Then, a few days later, another package arrived. This time, it was a high-end wristwatch. Sleek, expensive, and far out of my budget, it was something I'd never have chosen for myself. The return address offered no answers, and when I searched the store's name online, nothing came up. The watch was beautiful, but the unease gnawing at me only deepened with each new package. Over the next week, the deliveries kept coming, each more personal than the last. An expensive pair of shoes, a collection of rare vinyl records, a designer jacket. Each item seemed to speak to my tastes, but there was no way anyone could know me that well. I began to feel paranoid. How was this happening? Why was this happening? And most disturbingly, who was behind it? By the time the next package arrived, I decided to leave it unopened. I stared at it on my kitchen counter for hours, wondering if it would hold any answers. I considered returning it, but what if this was some elaborate prank? Yet, as the hours passed, that explanation seemed unlikely. No one I knew would go to such lengths, especially not with items this expensive. Then, as I sat there, my phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. The message was short, cryptic, "You've been chosen." My heart skipped a beat. Who was this? I checked the number, but it was unregistered, there was no way to trace it. A chill ran down my spine. I felt like I was being watched. The next day, another package arrived. Inside was a handwritten letter, a plain envelope containing a simple note, "We know what you like." It was signed with a strange symbol, one I didn't recognize. My pulse quickened. This wasn't a prank. It was something else. Something sinister. I spent hours researching the symbol, but there were no results. It was as if it didn't exist. I couldn't understand why someone would go to such lengths to send me things I hadn't ordered, and the fact that there was no trace of the sender only made it worse. I felt like I was spiraling, drawn into something I didn't understand. By now, I was in a full-blown panic. The deliveries kept coming, each one more bizarre than the last, a rare painting, a vintage car keychain, a high-end camera. Expensive items that I couldn't explain, each one building on the last. I thought about calling the police, but what could I tell them? There was no crime, no clear evidence. It was all just strange. Then, one day, the final package arrived. It was the biggest one yet, heavy, oddly shaped. My hands trembled as I opened it, bracing myself for whatever lay inside. When I pulled back the packing, I was met with a large ornate mirror. Its frame was intricately carved with symbols that seemed to shimmer in the light. I stared into the mirror, but something was wrong. My reflection twisted, contorted in ways that shouldn't have been possible. My breath caught in my throat as I backed away in horror. That's when it hit me, the truth. The deliveries. The items. The strange messages. It wasn't a coincidence. Someone, or something, was trying to pull me into something much bigger, something I wasn't prepared for. The mirror had shown me a glimpse of it, something I couldn't quite explain, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't just receiving packages anymore. I was part of a game, and I had no idea how to escape. Story 10. It was a quiet evening, the kind that draped itself over the world like a heavy blanket. I had been lounging on the couch, engrossed in a book, the world outside slipping away when the sound came. A sharp, sudden knock at the door, slicing through the silence like a blade. My heart skipped, a cold rush of dread sweeping over me. Who could possibly be at my door at this hour? I stood up instinctively, my mind racing through 1,000 questions. Peering through the peephole, the hallway outside was empty, not a soul in sight. At first, I thought it must be some kids playing a prank or a late-night delivery, but there was something about that knock. It felt wrong. I hesitated, a gnawing feeling in my gut urging me to ignore it, but something deeper pushed me to open the door. I swung it wide, hoping to find someone, anyone, maybe a neighbor in need, or a mistaken delivery. But the hallway was as vacant as it had been before. For a brief moment, I felt relief, thinking perhaps I had imagined the sound. But then my eyes fell to the floor near the threshold. A small piece of paper lay there, folded neatly as if placed with purpose. My breath caught, and my stomach churned as I bent down to pick it up. There was no name, no sign of who had left it. Just the paper, plain and simple, with a message scrawled in bold, uneven letters that made my blood run cold: "You're next." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, an overwhelming sense of dread clawing its way into my chest. My hand trembled as I held the paper, frozen for a moment, the weight of the message sinking in. Was it a sick joke? A twisted prank? Or was something far darker at play? I glanced down the hallway once more, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, but there was no one. The silence felt suffocating now, the usual hum of the building's old pipes and distant neighbor chatter gone. Only a thick, unsettling quiet remained. I stepped back into my apartment, locking the door behind me, still clutching the paper as if it were a lifeline. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the words, but there were no answers, no clues. Only that haunting message. I turned it over, hoping to find something, anything, that might give me a hint as to who had left it. But there was nothing. No fingerprints, no markings. Just those cold, taunting words. I thought about calling the police, but what could I say? I received a cryptic note. The absurdity of it made my skin crawl. Yet, the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. It was as if someone, somewhere, was waiting. I could feel it, eyes on me, the air in the room growing thicker, suffocating. I put the paper down on the kitchen counter, pacing back and forth, trying to quiet the storm in my head. Who would do something like this? And why me? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how mundane my life had been lately. No strange encounters, no ominous warnings, nothing. But the words on that paper wouldn't leave my mind. "You're next." What did it mean? Was I being targeted? Or was this just an eerie coincidence? Hours passed, but sleep never came. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those words, "You're next," flashing before me, each repetition feeling like a dark omen. The room felt smaller, as though the walls were closing in on me. I kept checking the windows, the door, the hallway outside, expecting to see someone who knew what was happening, someone who was always one step ahead. By morning, the message still hung over me like a shadow, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a prank. There was something deliberate in those words, something sinister. I left the apartment, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind, but it didn't. Each person I passed on the street seemed to hold some hidden knowledge, some connection to what was happening. Were they the ones who left the note? Were they watching me? That night, I stayed up late again, my eyes glued to the door, waiting for the inevitable. I didn't know what I was expecting, but the feeling in my gut told me that it wasn't over. The words on the paper, "You're next," were a warning, but not just a warning. They were a promise. The next morning, I was jolted from my sleep by the sound of a knock at the door. Sharp. Demanding. My heart pounded in my chest, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, as if the world had frozen around me, waiting for me to open that door. But I didn't. For the first time, I understood. Your next wasn't just a warning. It was a promise. And I was the one who was next.